Welcome to the Deep Dive, everybody. I'm Robert, and today we've got some really interesting material to get into with Linda, our expert guide. So, Linda, are you ready to dive in with me?
Absolutely, Robert. And hello to everyone listening out there. Today, we're going to be exploring some reflections from Lex Fridman on his interview with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. It's not just about the interview itself, but we'll be exploring the broader context of war peace and even how we talk about these things.
Right. So we're going to be getting into Fridman's own commentary, his goals, and maybe even some of the controversy that came out of that whole thing.
Exactly. Fridman really opens up about his preparation, his intentions, and even some of the backlash that he got. It really gets to the heart of some pretty complex issues surrounding this conflict.
One thing that really struck me right away was Fridman's dedication to research. He talks about spending hours studying peace talks, not just in the Ukraine conflict, but historically. I mean, he even mentions drawing insights from negotiations during the Vietnam War, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, that's a key point. Robert Friedman really emphasizes that understanding the historical context is essential for navigating the complexity of the present. For example, he learned that successful peace negotiations often involve concessions from both sides, something that's politically difficult, but often necessary for lasting peace.
And it seems like that historical lens, really directly informs his approach to the Zelenskyy interview. He's very upfront about wanting to present Zelenskyy in a positive light, but also to push for peace.
And that's where things start to get really interesting. Because how do you balance those two goals, especially when you're dealing with a wartime leader whose country is facing, existential threats?
Yeah, it's a tightrope walk for sure. And it gets even more complex when you consider that Fridman doesn't shy away from highlighting alternative perspectives. He brings up figures like Andrei Bodan, Zelensky's former chief of staff, who offered a different take on Zelensky's actions during the 2019 peace talks.
Right. For those who maybe aren't familiar, Bodan suggests that Zelenskyy might have missed opportunities for de-escalation back then, which, kind of adds a whole layer of what if to the current situation.
Yeah, definitely. And Friedman doesn't just drop these alternative perspectives in passing, he really digs into them. It's like he's trying to show that even in a conflict that seems as black and white as this one, there are shades of gray.
And those shades of gray, Robert, often hold the key to understanding the motivations, the missed opportunities, and the potential pathways to peace.
For sure. It really makes you wonder, were there other moments during the conflict where peace might have been more achievable?
Friedman seems to think so. He points to specific periods like the spring of 2022 after the successful defense of the North or the fall after the counteroffensive as, potential turning points where negotiations could have gained some traction.
So it's almost like he's suggesting there were these windows of opportunity that for various reasons were missed. And that raises some really thought-provoking questions about how we assess the ebb and flow of conflict and the choices that leaders make at these critical moments.
It's not just about analyzing the past, though. Robert Friedman argues that understanding these patterns is crucial for recognizing future opportunities for peace. He believes that now is a critical time for negotiation.
Why now specifically?
Well, he points to two main factors. First, he believes that U.S. support for Ukraine, while still strong, might not be inexhaustible. And second, he argues that Zelenskyy currently has leverage due to Ukraine's battlefield successes. Leverage that could diminish over time.
So Friedman is suggesting that this window of opportunity with Zelenskyy in a position of strength and Western support potentially waning might be the best chance for a negotiated settlement.
Exactly. And remember, Robert, he's not just an observer. He's actively trying to be a conduit for peace. He even name drops figures like Trump and Putin, highlighting his access and his willingness to engage with key players, however risky that might be.
Yeah, it's a bold approach, and one that clearly hasn't come without its critics. Friedman talks about facing significant backlash for his stance on the conflict, particularly for his comments about Zelensky's personality and his view of Putin.
And that's where we get into the really fascinating stuff, Robert. This is where Friedman's reflections on the psychology of the conversation and the complexities of wartime leadership, become central to understanding his approach.
Yeah.
So Friedman, he doesn't shy away from analyzing Zelensky's personality at all. He describes him as empathetic, emotional, a showman with layers of humor, but also someone with a strong ego and a temper.
It's interesting how he connects those personality traits to the challenges of negotiation.
Yeah.
Like he argues that Zelensky's charisma and, his ability to connect with people, those are undeniable assets. But that his strong emotions could make it difficult for him to make the cold, calculated decisions that peace negotiations often require.
Right, exactly. Friedman even admits that he had to adjust his own approach during the interview to navigate Zelensky's personality.
Yeah.
He talks about using humor to kind of, diffuse the tension and build some rapport, but also about being persistent in asking tough questions.
So it sounds like he's saying that understanding the psychology of your interlocutor, especially in a high-stakes situation like this, is just as important as understanding the geopolitical complexities.
Absolutely. And that brings us to what was perhaps the most controversial aspect of Friedman's commentary, his challenge to Zelensky's view of Putin.
This is where things got really heated online, right?
Yeah.
Friedman basically pushed back against Zelensky's assertion that Putin is incapable of love for his own country.
Exactly. Zelenskyy kind of painted this picture of Putin as someone driven solely by, a desire for power and conquest, someone who sees Ukrainians as just an obstacle to his ambitions. But Friedman argues that this kind of dehumanization, makes peace virtually impossible.
It's like he's saying you can't negotiate with someone you see as a monster. To find a path to peace, you have to acknowledge the humanity of the other side, even if you vehemently disagree with their actions.
And that's a really tough pill to swallow, especially for those who've experienced the horrors of this war firsthand. It's understandable that many Ukrainians, including Zelenskyy, would see Putin as the embodiment of evil.
But Friedman seems to be suggesting that clinging to that kind of hatred, while emotionally understandable, can become an obstacle to finding a resolution.
He even goes so far as to say that Putin, despite his actions, loves his country and its people. It's a pretty provocative statement, and one that sparked a lot of anger and accusations of appeasement.
Yeah, I can see why people would be outraged. But I think it's important to remember that Friedman isn't condoning Putin's actions or, trying to justify them. He's making a point about the complexities of human motivation, even in the context of, horrific violence.
He's essentially arguing that to understand Putin's actions, we have to acknowledge that he's operating within a particular worldview, a set of beliefs and motivations that, however misguided, are real to him.
And that understanding, Friedman seems to be saying, is essential if we want to find a way out of this conflict. It doesn't mean excusing Putin's actions, but it does mean recognizing that he's not like a two-dimensional villain, but a complex human being with his own internal logic.
And that logic, Robert, is often shaped by historical narratives, cultural influences, and personal experiences that, we may not fully grasp. Friedman seems to be saying that peace requires empathy, not just for the victims of conflict, but also, to some extent, for those who perpetrate it.
It's a radical idea, and one that a lot of people would probably reject outright. But Friedman, he doesn't shy away from challenging conventional wisdom. He even anticipates the criticism, acknowledging that his views might be perceived as naive, even dangerous.
But he pushes back against those accusations head on. He argues that it's those who advocate for endless war, those who refuse to consider alternative perspectives, who are truly being naive. He points to the immense human cost of the conflict, the lives lost, the families torn apart, the futures just shattered.
He's basically saying, look, war is hell.
Yeah.
And while it's easy to get caught up in the righteous anger, the desire for revenge, those emotions can lead us down a path of endless suffering.
Right. He challenges us to consider the possibility that compromise, however painful, might be the only way to break that cycle of violence. He even draws a parallel to personal relationships, arguing that even in the midst of a conflict, sometimes the most difficult thing, but also the most courageous, is to reach out, to listen, and to try to understand the other side.
It's a powerful message, and one that really resonates with me personally. But I'm curious, is Friedman being overly idealistic here? Can we really expect people to empathize with someone like Putin?
Yeah.
Given the scale of the atrocities that have been committed?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Friedman doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but he does make a really compelling case for the importance of dialogue, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. He argues that refusing to engage, to even try to understand the other side, is essentially surrendering to the logic of perpetual war.
So he's challenging us to think differently about conflict, right? To kind of move beyond these simplistic narratives of good versus evil and to recognize that messy, complex reality of human motivations.
It's a call for nuance, Robert, in a world that increasingly seems to crave simplicity. And, it's not an easy call to heed, especially when emotions are running so high.
But I think that's exactly why Friedman's perspective is so valuable. He's forcing us to confront those uncomfortable truths, to ask ourselves, whether our desire for retribution, our righteous anger, might actually be perpetuating the cycle of violence.
And he's not just offering criticism. He's proposing an alternative right. He argues that true leadership requires a willingness to actually sit down with your enemy, to listen to their perspective, and to search for that common ground even when it seems impossible.
It's a vision of leadership that goes beyond the battlefield. It recognizes that lasting peace can only be achieved through dialogue, understanding, and ultimately compromise.
He even suggests that the very act of listening to your opponent, of trying to understand their worldview can be a form of resistance, a way of challenging the, dehumanizing narratives that fuel conflict.
That's a powerful idea. It makes me wonder if by truly listening to our enemies, we might discover that we actually have more in common than we think. Perhaps we all share those same fundamental desires for security, for belonging, for a sense of purpose.
Perhaps, Robert. And perhaps by recognizing those shared desires, we can start to build those bridges across the divides that separate us.
So what does all this mean for, the listener out there? What can they take away from Friedman's reflections?
Well, I think Friedman's commentary offers a really valuable framework for approaching any conflict, whether it's, a global war or even just a disagreement with a loved one. He reminds us to be curious, to seek out different perspectives, and to resist that temptation to oversimplify.
So he's essentially saying, don't just accept those easy answers, the convenient narratives. Dig deeper, ask questions, and be open to the possibility that you might not have all the answers.
And most importantly, be willing to engage in respectful dialogue, even with those you disagree with. It's in those difficult conversations that we often find the seeds of understanding and the potential for positive change.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope for peace if we're willing to do the hard work of understanding, listening, and compromising.
Well said, Robert. This has been a truly thought-provoking deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
And thank you, Linda, for sharing all your insights. And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has left you with some food for thought. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deeper. This is Robert signing off.
And this is Linda reminding you that peace begins with understanding.